Hello everybody, in this lecture I will talk about hermeneutic and interactional approaches to narrative. I put this picture as a form of introduction to the topic because I think that it will represent both hermeneutic and interactional approaches. Why? Hermeneutic approach is about understanding the meaning of a narrative, why narratives are told, and how listeners extract, capture, or find its meaning. It means that it includes both narrator and listener into the analysis. So the analysis is not possible without thinking of both narrator and listener, which is the situation pictured here. We have narrator, the lady, and listeners around. And sometimes the role can change. Somebody from the audience can start tell his or her own narrative, and from narrator the narrator becomes listener. The interactional approach focuses on the situation in which narration happens. It means on narration as a speech event. Narration is not something abstract. Narration is an event that happens in a particular situation, which some social settings, and even if we read a narrative, for example, the Constitutional Declaration, we read it in a particular situation, we have some assumption about the purpose of the narrative, and we read it because of or in order to do homework or curiosity, and all this context, social context and situation context, has impact on how we understand and how we manage the narrativity and the narrative as a form of communication. The hermeneutic approach is linked to the French scholar Paul Ricoeur, who has not come with the term, but he developed the method of hermeneutic approach to narratives. He dealt also with metaphors, but we will talk about his contribution to narrative analysis. Hermeneutics, the term comes from the Greek word hermeneuo, which means translate, interpret. Sometimes hermeneutic approach is called as interpretative approach, and hermeneutics is said to be art of interpretation, and was in the past hermeneutics concerned interpretation of sacred and holy texts, interpretations of sacred scriptures, how to bring the meaning which was from outside of the world, which was metaphysical or religious. So how to capture this superhuman meaning in scriptures and to translate it into human existence. In meaning used in current scholarly literature, hermeneutics means interpretation, how we interpret something. So hermeneutic approach is about interpretation of narrative, and it means understanding its intersubjective and cultural meaning. Intersubjective, it means in the situation that we understand the narrative in the context of its narrator. So when we listen to some narrative, we think why the narrator tells me this particular narrative. So this is intersubjectivity. We think about us as a person, as two persons with some purpose, some intentions. And cultural meaning is that we interpret it in some cultural context. It means that it's not only between two of us or in previous situation. This is not only intersubjective that they recognize each other as a human being, able to think, to understand, to have intention, purpose, but also they understand what is told in the cultural context. What does it mean for our culture? So there are other narratives, and we relate the actual narrative to other narratives. We relate it to our values, etc. So the interpretation, the hermeneutic approach, focuses on intersubjective, so interpersonal, and cultural meanings. And the example could be from the declaration. This is one example of narrative, how something is expressed by narrative. Thus our working people first free themselves from the shackles of foreign rule, etc. And the second, I hope you can see it, the second example is the list of sentences, offenses and sentences. And they both give us some information, a message, but we understand it differently. This we understand that there are something that happened, and it can have consequences because it happened and some people participated. It involve us as readers, as human beings, into the story, into the process. So even if we know that it was in the past and it is ideological assertion, we feel that it was lived by some people, and or it could be lived by some people. So it's involving us as a subject. While the second, this is something that concerned us because perhaps we are accused of some offense, but it is something outside us. It doesn't require our subjectivity, our understanding as human beings. It doesn't expect our subjectivity. It's just objective things, and it is also important information. We should know it if we are concerned, but the type of communication is different. This is the narrative communication, and this is just a list or analytic communication. And in relation to Paul Ricoeur, for him, the narratives are ability or capability to transform time from the objective time, chronological time, into human time, into time we can understand. Because understand time is not to understand what would mean 25 years, it is difficult. We can, of course, we know 5 years, it's some months and days, and it's a long time. But how long, if it's too long or not enough long, and what does it mean for our life if we are 5 years in prison? So this is not this analytical description is not, or instructions are not able to communicate the time as a human experience. While this story makes or enable us, makes it possible to understand the dynamics, what happened. It involves, as I said before, it involves us as actors of the story, even if the story already passed, but it makes us part of it, of the human society. While this is just information, yes. So for Paul Ricoeur, what was the most important in narratives was that they are able to transform objective time into human time. And this is a quotation from his, and he wrote his opus magnum, which is called Time and Narrative. It is 3 books. It consists of 3 books, and it's very interesting. Sometimes lengthy, but some parts are very interesting to read. So I recommend to just borrow it in the library or look at the internet. And the quotation is: "The world unfolded by every narrative work is always a temporal world. Time becomes a human time to the extent that it is organized after the manner of a narrative. Narrative, in turn, is meaningful to the extent that it portrays the features of temporal experience." This assertion that time becomes human time to the extent that it's organized after the manner of a narrative is very strong and very important. That if we want to communicate something that includes temporal dimension, the best way is to communicate it through narratives. It concerns sentences, like sentences, not sentences in the grammatic sense, but in linguistic sense, but sentences in the panel system, or number of infected, or whatever numbers related to time, the growth of infected. All these chronological dimension is understandable as a human if it's told through narrative, not in the form of table or in the form of list, etc. This is Paul Ricoeur's idea, and I agree with him that if we are. That's why the declaration of in the Czechoslovak constitution is in narrative form, to make the constitution understandable in the form of human experience, not just as a law. And to capture what happens with time in narrative, Paul Ricoeur developed a concept of threefold mimesis. Mimesis is Greek word, as hermeneutics, mimesis is Greek word, and in a Ricoeur sense, mimesis means a creative imitation, like metaphor. It's something, it's imitation. Mimesis is mimetic, means imitate. But in his sense, it's not mechanical imitation. It's a sense how to metaphorically or how to creatively imitate something. So, if we talk about threefold mimesis, so we talk about threefold creative work of imitating something. And for Ricoeur, narrative as a representation of human temporality, which is important, emerged as a result of three distinct imaginary activities, three distinct mimesis, three distinct creative imitations: prefiguration, configuration, and refiguration. Or mimesis 1, mimesis 2, mimesis 3. What is prefiguration or mimesis 1? When we want to start, or when we want to tell a narrative, a story, to be able to create a story, we have to first have idea that there is some sequence of events that happened. We must be able to think about world in terms of chronological ordering. Without this ability to see events past, we are not able to tell story. This is for the young children. For them, it is difficult sometimes to create good story because they don't see this chronological deepness. So they live just their present. So it's difficult for them to create a story. So they just have it happened to me this. They cannot make in their head. They cannot see the chain of events linked together. So the first to be able to produce narrative, the narrator has to see the world as a course of events, and he must understood it in a specific way to be able to narrate it. So not only to perceive the sequence of events, to see it as something happened, but to be able to contribute to it and to tell about it. This is the first mimesis for prefiguration, because figuration is the figure, is the picture, the plot. So this is before creating plot. We must be able to see the course of event that happened in past, and it is creative imitation. So in the narrative, we imitate the sequence of events that happened by creative manner. So we don't tell the chronic how things happened, but we creatively approach it. And this is in configuration. In configuration, we create actual narrative that we create a plot. So we know that something happened, some sequence of events happened, and we realize that to be tellable as a story, as a narrative, we must make it interesting for and understandable for our listeners. If author wants to write an essay or a book or something in the form of narrative, he or she must invent the plot. Why he or she is narrating the story. And it could be explicit, but also it's implicit. For example, the message, which is in the end. So in a configuration, the events are encoded into a text by the narrator. So the plot is established in configuration. So first, we have to be able to see course of events in the world. Next, we must be able to creatively transform the sequence of events into a plot. So to select some of events, some aspect of events, and to combine them into the plot. And for example, chronologically reorder it and to begin with the end, and etc. And in Mimesis 3, the refiguration, this is part of the listener. As I started with the picture of the lady telling the story, this is the part of listeners. In a refiguration, the listener or the reader reconstruct the logic of the story, what happened, the sequence of events from the narrative, and get idea of the course of the events. So this is, and that could be quite different from what the author, narrator, imagined as the meaning of the course of the event. The reconfiguration could be different. It doesn't mean it's creative. It's all these mimesis are creative steps. So first creativity is to transform the sequence of events in the world we see into the narrative. First is to transform the world we perceive into the sequence of events. So the ability to see the chain of events. The second is to transform the chain of events we discovered in the world into a narrative, to create a plot or to find a plot. And third is the listener who somehow decode creatively what he or she hears into sequence of events and the message which is related to the sequence of events in the narrative. So these are three particular mimetic activities, and this is the recurse idea. And here I show you an example of such analysis. This is analytic approach, how to study narratives. It's not so much as that the world is that there are mimesis, but if we want to analyze narratives, we must be aware that there are three creativities, three levels of creativity, and we should not forget these three levels of creativities in our analysis. This is the strip you already know from the previous lectures, and I put above what I imagine as prefiguration, narrator's prefiguration. It means the author's prefiguration, what the author of this strip had to have in his head in order to create, to be able to create a narrative. So the first is he should know about course of conversation, that there are turn-taking. This is important to create a narrative. It is important to realize that in conversations in real world, people are changing, they are exchanging expressions. So this is important to know about it, or to see it in the world. The second, he or she must be able to see male-female relations, that there is a course, singles, it starts with singles, dating, marriage, household. This is also important. Without realizing that, he or she wouldn't be able to create the strip. This is the prefiguration, the knowledge or the imagination that is necessary to be able to create a plot. Narrator's configuration, the plot, is the strip, the funny thing or the interesting thing that yes, this is the plot, and reader's refiguration, how the reader interprets what's going on. So it could be, it depends of course on the reader, but it could be the dog is right, when people marry they care only about themselves. You see the time, the sequence of events. The dog knows that once the marriage is done, the people care only about the couple cares only about themselves. So the time is the chronology or the sequence is apparent there, or it could be a stereotype view of partner's career. So it would be my refiguration that this strip is funny for people who don't care about stereotypes, but I care about stereotypes, about gender stereotype. So for me, this strip reproduce the stereotypes of partner's career. And the model of threefold mimesis integrates all three levels of mimetic levels or imaginary levels, and by doing it integrates both the narrator's understanding of the world, which precedes the narration, and the reader's interpretation of the narrative, which occurs subsequently. While in contrast to structure analysis, Labov and Proprian analysis focus only on the plot. So in previous structure or network analysis, the focus was on the plot, and Ricker's contribution is that he said it's just 1/3 of the narrative. You must think how it was possible that narrator was able to create such plot, and the second, what understanding is on the level of the listener or the reader. And this is really a huge idea to put all these three together, and it changed narrative analysis, definitely. But for sociology, it's not as important the impact of Ricker on narrative or melatology, interpretation of fictions, etc., but the methodological implications that it brings to sociology. And for me, especially what is urgent is need for reflexivity when we analyze narratives. To be reflexive of what's going on when we analyze narrative. For example, we can have narrative interviews as data, or biographies, or media documents, or textual data that contain narratives. And usually we start with the plot, and we try to analytically deconstruct the plot to see the prefiguration, to see the thinking of the author, what the author what the author intended to communicate what was the author's understanding of the world. For example, if we have narrative interviews, we want to find what the narrator think about the world, and we can sociologically interpret it. So this is, it starts with the step 2 and is going into the step 1, into the step pre-understanding. So it starts in 2 and it's going to 3 directly. But the Ricker's idea warn us that this approach or this procedure is not valid, because we should start with mimesis 3, with refiguration, and to ask question how we understand a narrative or this and that narrative, how readers or listeners understand it. So first we should ask, when we have some narrative interview, what is our position? How we what will be our analytical position? How we understand who is telling the story? What's going on in the story? Are we able to extract the intersubjective meaning? Are we able to extract the cultural meaning that is communicated? Are we able to extract the chronology? For example, if we talk to people or if we analyze narratives of people that are not from our culture milieu, from different situations with different life experience, from different culture, are we able to understand them? Or would it be pure misinterpretation? This is the urgent question at the beginning of research, not the head or the thought of the narrator, but our ability to understand it. And if we decide that, or another question, who was the listener, original listener of the story? If we take something from media documents, are we able to read it, for example, from the history, from the last century narrative, which is 100 years old? Are we able to read it as is what it read by readers, contemporary readers, or it's just impossible to reconstruct the meaning readers had at their time? So these are first question we should ask. The second question is about the standard question about the plot, how the plot relates to both to listeners and to the author. Where does the plot come from? What is story and discourse in narrative? This is like regular structuralist or whatever analysis of narratives. And the last question is, what is the author's pre-understanding of the world? How, by analyzing the plot, being aware of our interpretation, of our understanding, what we can say about the world of the author, how it was possible for him or her to create such a plot, what are conditions or social context for creating the story. Can we see the author behind the narrative? This is the last and most complicated question. This methodological, also I have my personal experience with research and narratives is that I analyze biographical narratives. I got some results. I published it, and I used quotes from the narratives in my paper to illustrate or document my findings. And I found that readers from other cultural context they understood these quotations differently, and they found them excellent, but for other reasons, not for the reason I put them into my paper. I want I was I thought that I illustrate something, and they found that it's a good illustration, but of something different. So this is also the problem, that when we write our findings, write the paper or thesis, you should think who will be your reader, and will your reader be able to understand the narrative we use as our data? Is our audience able to understand the data of our respondents or narratives of our respondents? This is also one practicality which is well covered by the Bricker's concept of threefold mimesis. Interactionist approach. As I said at the beginning, telling a narrative is a speech event. It's a performance. It never happens in a vacuum. It's always situated in some social context, and we can take inspiration from Gampertz, his book famous book Discourse Strategies, that speech events imply certain expectancies about thematic progression, turn-taking rules, form and outcome of the interaction, as well as constraint on context. It means that both narrator and listeners, they have some expectations about narratives. So this is why Labov found that narratives are or the first section of narratives is frequently abstract. That in abstract we inform listeners or readers what we are going to tell them, and to create some expectation, because if we don't satisfy the expectation, they will not listen till the end. They will just stop listening or say, what I'm telling about, what I'm speaking about. So, and it is also question or problem or issue for narrator, that narrator, if he or she thinks or guess he or she wouldn't be able to fulfill expectancies of listeners, he or she will never start the narrative. I don't tell jokes because I'm afraid that I will not be funny, and this is because of the situation and the expectation. What is also important is that the identity of people assigned in the situation are important for telling stories. If we receive identity of a bad guy, our stories are always regarded as justifications or excuse or this hermeneutic of suspicion. And while if we receive identity of a good guy or something important or famous, all our stories are funny. This is typical for the jokes of people who are expected to telling jokes, that we are ready to laugh. And in sociological research, it is very important what identity we assign to the narrator. If it is if we approach somebody as an alcoholic, and and ask, please, you as an alcoholic, tell me your life story, how you first start to drink and so on. Or if we approach the same person as famous artist and ask, you as famous artist, please tell me your life story. Or if we approach the same person as somebody who was accused and who sat in prison for 5 years, the identity we assign in the situation has a strong impact on the story told in the situation. And an example is from my research, which I have done on the set of biographical interviews. And first it was oral history interviews, and I had idea that these are biographical narratives, and it means that there is a question at the beginning about, we will see it, about please tell me your life, etc., and that the narrator tell the story. But I found that during narration there are many cooperative questions coming from narrator, as, are you following me? I just lost the thread. Wait, where were we before? Or do you remember it? Have you ever been there? The narrator asks these questions to be sure that the listener understands well the story. This is again the recurse 3-4 method. He is verifying, the narrator is verifying if he or she is understood correctly, or if he is or if the listener follows his ideas. And the responses from the listener are important. For example, you'll be talking about and reconstructing the topic of what was before, which could be different from the topic when the narrator lost the thread. Or do you remember it? Have you ever been there? And if the listener says, yes, I remember, I've been there, and so do you remember the house and the situation and the people, and the story change. That's why the narrator asks to be able to adapt the story for the purpose of the situation. Also, it could have encouraging consequences if the listener encourage the narrator to continue and to go into detail, or inhibiting effect if the answer, do you remember it? Have you ever been there? No, I know nothing about it. So it has inhibiting an effect on the narrator, and the narrator doesn't continue in this direction because, or in the contrary, continue because he knows that this is the field which is not covered, or this is not known to the listener. So there is possibility to explore the topic. And there is an example of how the role assigned by the narrator influenced the narrative, is that we remark that some biographies, there were 200 biographies, oral history biographies or history interviews, which resulted in biographies, and some of them were very short. And we found that these, which were very short, was by narrators who couldn't find their they couldn't create a plot because they don't know what is publicly interesting in their life, what would interest the researcher or the public, because it was semi-public interview, what could be said about their life in the form of narrative and would interest the listener. So the question at the beginning, I would kindly ask you to narrate me your life story, and if you could start by where were you born, when and how was your childhood. And the lady, the narrator, summarize their life in 30-second biography. So I was like an only child. I grew up in the farmer family. I went to elementary school here in Smiřice. When I got out of elementary school, I wanted to be a confectioner or dressmaker, but there was no free place, so they set me to wait a year so that I should go somewhere to work meanwhile. Well, I went here to the castle into a computing station to ask. They said me that as I was 16 years old, I could hardly handle it. Well, then that they would try me for 3 months, and there we worked on a sort of punching machines. Well, since I managed everything and I was as good at it, and I just started to earn some money, so I was there a year and I didn't want to go somewhere, like to start apprenticeship, not even by accident. So, as I just said, that they let me there. So you see that this part is like the apprenticeship till 17 years old, and the rest of the life I worked there until the end, until it went bankrupt. End of biography. And the researcher had to restart. Yes, thank you, and please could you specify what was the kind of family you lived in and you grew up in etc. We can see that for the narrator, the important word was the way how she got her job, and next the 50 years or 40 years of her work was like put in one sentence. I worked there until the end, until it went bankrupt. So nothing happened, no story there. And this is not that the lady could not narrate. After they found some sort of identity she could use as a narrator to produce an interesting story. For example, as mother, as citizen, etc. She could narrate longly, but as no one, as normal people, ordinary person, it was very difficult for her to produce life story. So she produced just short employment narratives, because what to say to public about my life? What do you want to know? What exactly? About my education, about my family life, about what? So this is very important. This is an example how important is to assign good identity to narrator in a research interview, because on the identity, the narration would follow. And what concerns the social situation, the storytelling or the narratives don't occur randomly in society, and so there are some social settings that are friendly, narrative friendly. Sometimes it is even necessary to tell the story. But sometimes the story is not welcome. For example, in the question is in courtrooms, they ask to respond yes or not, or just explain, not to tell the story, what happened, because the story is to be reconstructed by judge or by the jury or by attorney. They are competent to tell the story, not the person. Maybe the victim or the offender can tell their stories, but not the third part as in this paper. It's about using narratives in courtrooms, the third party guilds and their right to tell their story. Usually they are not allowed to tell the story. They are allowed to inform about like individual acts, but not to connect them into the story. Sometimes the other different occasions when the story is welcome, but for example in school examination the story is understood that it's not about the topic. The story is how to excuse that one doesn't know the topic. So if student starts to tell the story, for teacher it's something be cautious, because the right answer is not in the form of story, it's just information, and the story is dangerous not dangerous, but it's suspicious if it occurs during examination. If the question is, tell me something about narrativity, and the students answer, I will tell you a story. Once, blah, 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 blah. So you understand that it's not what is expected in the situation of examination. But sometimes, for example, in the family meeting, people are expected to tell a story, not to inform other people about something, but to inform, but in the form of a story, especially funny or tragic and what concerns the cultural meaning of narrative, this reflects that in a culture it is expect that some people can tell about something, not about other things. So if we start with the last line, there are historical moments when some sort of stories enter public discourse and is allowed to enter public discourse. This is described in Plummer's book Telling Sexual Stories. That sexual stories were not, or the stories of private sexual life were not allowed to enter into public arena, public discourse, public sphere in television, in public media. They were not allowed to be told in public media. They were private. So sexual stories about sexual life, personal sexual life, were private and not allowed to enter public. The same could be the stories of offenders. They are frequently not allowed to be published in media, because the offender did something wrong, and if he or she tells the story, the public will be like convinced, or it would be unjust in for victims that were not allowed to tell their story. So there should be confronted stories, and so it creates tensions. Sorry. In some organizations, there are some organizational reasons for telling or not telling stories. In psychoanalytic sessions, the patients are encouraged to tell stories. In TV shows, sometimes in courtroom, as I showed before, in research interview. This is also organizational session that we forced, if I can say, our respondent to tell story. Please tell me your life. So there are organizational conditions for telling or not telling stories. There are situational stories that that expect that someone from present in the situation takes the role of a narrator. If we are in the evening, there are no light, so there are more people. We must spend the night or the evening together. There is nothing to do, so people start tell short stories, jokes, and it is situation that provoke or that stimulate, encourage people to become narrators and to tell the story. And even they can say, yes, let's tell the stories. Who starts to encourage or to force present people to tell some story. Or there could be personal motives that we want to communicate something we experienced, or we want to attract attention by telling our story, or convince somebody. So we can have a personal motives in some situation to become a narrator and to tell the story. Yes, thank you for your attention. And there is no homework for the next class, as you see. Goodbye.